and a very warm welcome to another edition of World Panorama. Like always, get ready to catch up on the biggest international news of the week. I'm Sana Khan. Before we get to detailed reports, here's a look at the top stories this week. Sri Lanka under pressure at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Colombo. Internal pressures force Indian Prime Minister to stay back. World Panorama gets you more. Israel dead against Iran's nuclear deal, even as nuclear watchdog says Iran has slowed down nuclear activity over the past 3 months. Obama calls for patience. Death toll from Typhoon Haiyan on the rise, millions without food and water, even as foreign aid continues to pour in. And Sachin Tendulkar plays his farewell series, his 200th Test match, enthralls his fans for one last time at the Wankhede Stadium in Mumbai. Our top story. After weeks of political friction, Sri Lanka is playing host to the 3-day Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, CHOGM, which began on Friday. Sri Lankan President Mahinda Rajapakse downplayed the absence of Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and said that he was satisfied with the presence of External Affairs Minister Salman Khurshid. Now, the Prime Minister, who was planning to attend the 3-day summit, according to reports, was forced to call off his plans because of competitive politics in the state of Tamil Nadu and fear of isolation of the Congress party in the state ahead of the Lok Sabha elections. Now, India, with 60% of the 2.3 billion population of the grouping, has a key say in Commonwealth, and along with big democracies like Britain, Australia and Canada, it can influence the way it moves forward. It was not just the Indian Prime Minister, but the Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper and his Mauritian counterpart Naveen Chandra Ramgoolam. They also chose to keep away from the summit, citing the poor human rights record of Sri Lanka. The agenda of the summit, opened by Britain's Prince Charles, includes sessions on debt restructuring and climate change. Now, will the 2013 Commonwealth Summit in Colombo be a test of the multilateral grouping's commitment to its core values of democracy, human rights and the eradication of poverty across all member states? As the CHOGM, or the summit that we're talking about, gets underway, this question poses a major challenge to several world leaders in attendance, given the international furor over large-scale human rights violations against the island nation's Tamil population by the Sri Lankan government and armed forces, not only in the final days of the war against the LTT in 2009, but also in the years since.
CHOGM 2013 will provide the opportunity for us to assess the Commonwealth achievement with regard to development goals. If the Commonwealth is to remain relevant to its member countries, the association must respond sensitively to the needs of its people and not let it turn into a punitive or judgmental body.
Well, I think it's important to shine a spotlight on what's happened in this country and to speak up against abuses that have taken place and make sure that those people in the north of the country do have a proper voice. Now, there's been some progress. There have been elections in the north, and that is welcome, but there still hasn't been enough truth-telling about what happened, and I think it's important to go there and to make these points.
Let's discuss this in detail. Joining me on the show this week is former Indian High Commissioner to Britain, Mr. Nalin Surie. Thank you so much, sir, for joining me on World Panorama. Let me first start by asking you, there's a lot of talk about how the Indian Prime Minister didn't go to this summit because of internal pressures back home. Do you think it was the right stand for the Prime Minister to stay back and send Salman Khurshid instead?
Well, in my personal view, the Prime Minister should have gone. But you also have to bear in mind that it's not the first time that the Indian Prime Minister would not have attended a CHOGM summit. For instance, at the last summit in Australia, PM was not present. In fact, India was represented by the Vice President at that summit. And there have been earlier occasions also where the Indian Prime Minister has not attended. But I think on this occasion, since the summit was being hosted by an immediate neighbor, an extremely important partner of India's, a country where India has a very major role to play, and also the fact that this summit was now being held in Asia after almost a quarter of a century. I think that for that and a variety of reasons, in my personal view and judgment, the Prime Minister should have gone. But if the Prime Minister did not go, I think there would have been good reason for him not to go. And you cannot take these decisions in isolation.
And what do you say about the reports coming out in the media talking about pressures that force the Prime Minister to stay back? Because if we talk about these pressures, then, our country, it can be influenced by other neighbors as well, like we have troubles with China, with Pakistan. We have these issues, and if the Prime Minister, is forced by, let's say, Mamata Banerjee in the state of West Bengal or other political parties, if we talk about, then how feasible is it for India to twist and change its foreign policy in course of such events?
Well, this has become a major issue in the functioning of India's foreign policy, in particular in recent months and years. Partly it's because you have a situation where governments in the states are not necessarily in tune with the central government. But I think in these cases a broader national interest has to prevail, and ultimately it is for the centre to ensure that the constitutional provisions are upheld. And in terms of the constitution, foreign policy is very clearly the monopoly right of the central government. But obviously, having said that, you cannot ignore what the states believe in these matters. So I think it's for the Foreign Office and it's for the central government to convince the state governments that what the decisions that they intend to take are actually in their benefit, into their advantage. Now, it may seem in the short term that these are not to the advantage, for instance, of the states concerned. I mean, you mentioned West Bengal, and I would in this case talk about Tamil Nadu. But I think in point of fact, whatever the government wants to do vis-a-vis, for instance, the Tamil community in Sri Lanka is a benefit to Tamil Nadu. And if Tamil Nadu stands in the way of our doing that kind of work, then I think it is to Tamil Nadu detriment in the long term. So it is also necessary for the centre to work much harder in convincing the provincial government, the state government, that what we intend to do is in their own national interest, in their own state's interest.
Right. Now we have seen some tough words coming in from various leaders. In particular, we talk about David Cameron, who was in India also for a short while. He said that there must be accountability for the past in terms of Sri Lanka and respect for human rights today. He also visited Jaffna. Now, do you think India has missed this crucial opportunity for the Prime Minister? He should have, do you think, gone to Jaffna, met the TNA leader over there who's just come to power with a thumping majority. Do you think we've lost that crucial chance, or can we make up for it?
I know this is what is being said in the media, but let's face it, I think the role that Britain plays in Sri Lanka is relatively marginal when compared to the role that India plays in Sri Lanka. Now, it's very good for Mr. Cameron to go to Jaffna and have a photo op, but what is Britain doing in Jaffna, I'd like to know. So, Britain is distant, it can afford to take this position, but let's also not forget that when the decision was taken that Sri Lanka would host this summit in 2013, the British government, then headed by Gordon Brown, went along, and there was no opposition from the then Conservative Party. So, I think you have to take everything in context. It's necessary for the British Prime Minister to attend, for the simple reason that the Commonwealth is headed by the Queen at present.
Right.
And if the British Prime Minister does not attend, then I think it's a loss of face for the Queen also. I mean, and in this case, her son is representing her, but he is the next in line to the throne.
Right.
So I think the British case is very different from the Indian case. But of course, our Foreign Minister, Mr. Khurshid, has already lamented the fact that he could not take PM to Jaffna. That is true, but I think there will be other opportunities for the Prime Minister to go to Jaffna, and there will be. These are all short-term memory situations.
Right.
And I think what we are doing on the ground is far more important. And yet I come back to what I said at the beginning. In my personal view, the Prime Minister should have gone. Whether or not he went to Jaffna is not relevant.
Okay, I take your point. Now let's talk about the theme of this year's summit, which is growth and equity, inclusive growth. Now, after the war on LTTE, do you think this is a big enough opportunity for Sri Lanka to portray itself, to show the development of its country since the war had taken place? Do you think to some extent it would be successful in doing so?
I think it would. The fact is that most Commonwealth countries are being represented at the highest level at the summit. And I think the important thing here is the theme of the conference. And I'm glad this is a theme because in my view, in the last several years and I'd say a couple of decades, the Commonwealth has actually lost the basic developmental focus.
Okay.
It's important for it to come back to development focus. Democracy and human rights are very good. They are the basis for membership of the Commonwealth. But you cannot perpetuate or strengthen or sustain democracy and human rights unless you have some development. So I think the theme is important. It allows Sri Lanka to showcase the fact that it has defeated the LTTE, that it is perhaps moving towards normalcy. But time will tell whether they've been successful or not.
Right. And my last question to you is, we talk about these summits and we talk about how, these summits are just meeting grounds and nothing effective really comes out of summits, whether we talk about this summit or many others. But a generic view from you on how these summits are more of from being a multilateral, meeting ground for all these big diplomats, world leaders, it's becoming more of a meeting ground for bilateral issues as well. Do you think that's a positive or not so much?
Well, look, every summit where heads of state meet and heads of government meet enables them to also meet bilaterally. So you don't want to miss opportunities. Instead of having to make a special visit, you can discuss bilateral issues on the sidelines of multilateral conferences. But multilateral conferences are important in their own right. This is a much more, it's a cliche, but this is a much more globalized world. Everything is interactive these days. Everything is interrelated. So it's important for leaders to meet at the highest level, have a meeting of minds. It's so much easier than to implement decisions that are taken. And I think it's not right to say that summits come up with decisions which are not implemented. When you have a consensus amongst, let's say, 53 or 100, 200, 180 countries, it is obvious that you are looking at very often at a least common denominator situation.
Right.
But if you didn't have the summit, you wouldn't even have that. And take the Millennium Development Goals, for instance. They are a very important set of parameters to which the world community is committed to implement. And these goals are being implemented. Not always successfully, but it's happening. So I don't think we should write off the importance of multilateral gatherings, or for that matter, insist that multilateral gatherings should only be used for multilateral purposes.
All right.
It enables very important bilateral meetings to take place in an atmosphere that is, and in a venue very often which is neutral.
Right.
So that is very helpful.
So CHOGM meeting, summit, the fact remains it is important, and the theme of this summit is equally very, very important. Let's hope that that does not get sidelined with other smaller issues at this point taking precedence over the main issue over here. Thanks so much, sir. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
I'd just like to say one thing before we conclude. The media may present the human rights issue as the big issue of this summit. That does not detract from the fact that the summit will have a meaningful program of action.
Right.
And the important thing is that that program of action should be implemented. And for that, there is a secretariat. There are member states who would be interested because, as I said, the Commonwealth hopefully will come back to a developmental focus rather than focusing on political issues.
All right. Well said. Perfectly appropriate for ending this discussion. Thanks, sir, so much once again for joining me on the show. Now, with that, let's move on to a related report asserting that UK and India should be partners of choice. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron said the two countries have made extraordinary progress on trade and investment since 2010 and that the positive momentum should continue. Cameron touched down in the metropolis for a brief visit en route to attending the CHOGM summit at Colombo.
British Prime Minister David Cameron sought to boost trade and investments and to work together on global issues with India.
The trade relationship is as good as it is because Britain is such an open country. We welcome foreign investment unlike any other country in Europe. So trade is at the heart of it, but it goes much further because, and that's what we need to develop more, the people-to-people relationships, the cultural relationships, and also I think working together on some of these difficult global issues.
Cameron arrived in India on 13 November on stopover visit on his way to Sri Lanka, making it his third visit to the country in 2 years. During his visit, Cameron also met Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and discussed crucial bilateral and international issues.
I think that Britain and India should be partners of choice. I think we've got a lot in common. You're the largest democracy, we're one of the oldest democracies. We both have challenges to fight terrorism. We both want to be successes in this global economic race that we're engaged in. We've got all the ties of the past and the history and the language and the culture, but it's the future that really excites me about what Britain and India can do together.
On India's decision to send Salman Khurshid instead of Manmohan Singh to the CHOGM summit in Colombo, Cameron said, though he endorsed its stand, but said he had a different take.
Of course, there's always a case for not going somewhere, but I think actually we'll get further by going and having conversations with the Sri Lankans about what needs to happen and shining a light on some of the issues and the problems that are there. And because I'm going to the north of the country, I'll be taking journalists with me.
In his meeting with Manmohan Singh, the two leaders reviewed the progress in bilateral economic and commercial ties and expressed satisfaction that despite the continuing global economic slowdown and the Eurozone difficulties, India-UK trade ties have been resilient.
Time for a short break. On the other side, the latest on the aftermath of the deadly Typhoon Haiyan. Philippines struggles to get back on its feet as the death toll keeps rising. I'll be back. You're watching World Panorama. The number of people in the Philippines confirmed dead from Typhoon Haiyan continues to rise. It is likely to cross the 5,000 mark as relief and rehabilitation continues to be slow in pace. 1 week after the storm, food and supplies are now beginning to reach survivors, but aid agencies say the logistics of distribution are enormous. The Philippine government has defended its response to the disaster, one of the strongest storms ever on land.
The destruction caused by Typhoon Haiyan was nothing like the Philippines had ever seen. The deadly storm has affected 7 million people across 41 provinces. Nearly 1,50,000 houses are damaged and over 5.8 lakh people have been displaced. Medical supplies, teams of doctors, pallets of water and food piled on trucks, planes and ferries are only trickling into the Philippine city. But challenges of delivering the assistance meant few received any help in Tacloban.
We are here to help the Philippine population, and they are suffering quite a lot, and I hope we can do a lot for them.
The United Nations has not yet released the exact number of victims, but according to an initial estimation, more than 2,000 people are feared dead till now. In the aftermath of the superstorm, Tacloban has been completely cut off. Only a handful of survivors had been able to fly out, while most have been left homeless and with no way to communicate with their family members. United Nations has launched a $301 million relief plan in Manila. The action plan will cover rescue operations for a period of 6 months.
This action plan asks for $301 million. It is for agency response in basically all sectors of humanitarian assistance. The figures now is that we estimate, or rather the government estimate, and we are reflecting that figure, that 11.3 million people have been affected by the typhoon in 9 regions across central Philippines.
It's very clear that there are very, very many areas that we haven't reached yet. The Philippines is there are over 7,000 islands in the Philippines. It's a very coastal population. Most people live on the coast, and it's hard to reach these people even in normal circumstances. Right now, it is that much harder.
Philippine President has declared a state of national calamity and deployed hundreds of soldiers in Tacloban, a once vibrant port city of 220,000 that is now a wasteland without any sign of a government, as city and hospital workers focus on saving their families and securing food.
After 3 days of talks in Geneva that concluded in the early hours on 10th November, 6 world powers and Iran came tantalizingly close. They almost reached an agreement on interim measures which should have paved the way to a comprehensive settlement, constraining Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon in exchange for relief on sanctions. America's Secretary of State John Kerry even flew in to clinch the deal. Now, talks between lower-level officials are due to resume on the 20th of November. The question now is whether failure to agree was just a stumble or whether it was a missed opportunity that may now fatally prevent a diplomatic solution.
US Secretary of State John Kerry urged lawmakers to calm down over proposed new sanctions on Iran, warning they could scuttle diplomatic efforts to rein in Tehran's nuclear drive.
If we don't negotiate, Iran will continue to build its program and continue to be able to build a breakout capacity, and in fact the amount of time it will take them to break out will be less. What we have negotiated, we believe, is a very strong protocol which will restrict Iran's ability to be able to grow its program and to reach an agreement with them that we go into 6 months of negotiation on the real tough part of this. The fact is that we didn't put sanctions in place for the sake of sanctions. We did it to be able to negotiate and to negotiate a final agreement.
With the negotiators due to meet again on 20th of November, both Republicans and Democrats have urged that a new round of sanctions targeting the oil and banking industries of Iran could serve as a bargaining chip in the talks.
Total price of the sanctions, if they are fully implemented, in 2013, for example, or in 2014, was supposed to be around $100 billion to the overall Iranian economy. The Iranian GDP is between $400 to $450 billion annually. So the total price of the sanctions, full sanctions, real enforcement, is about $100 billion, which is between 20% to almost 25% of the Iranian GDP.
The Obama administration's dispute with Israel over Iran intensified. Israel warned that a bad deal with Iran on its nuclear program could lead to war.
Bad and dangerous deal that deals with a thing that affects our survival. And when it comes to the question of Jewish survival and the survival of the Jewish state, I will not be silenced. Ever. Not on my watch.
Negotiators on Iran's nuclear program failed to reach an agreement during weekend talks in Geneva. Iran says its nuclear program is a peaceful bid to generate electricity, but its refusal to halt sensitive work has drawn tough sanctions targeting its lifeblood oil exports.
And much else has been unfolding around the world. Here's a quick wrap of all the other international news of the week.
China unwrapped its boldest set of economic and social reforms in nearly 3 decades on Friday, relaxing its one-child policy and further freeing up markets in order to put the world's second-largest economy on a more stable footing. The sweeping changes helped dispel doubts about the leadership's zest for the reforms needed to give the economy fresh momentum as 3 decades of breakneck expansion show signs of faltering. A reform document released by the Communist Party following a 4-day conclave of its top brass promised land and residence registration reforms needed to boost China's urban population and allow its transition to a Western-style service and consumption-driven economy. The tiny, impoverished Balkan nation of Albania emerged on Friday as a likely location where Syria's chemical weapons stockpile could be destroyed. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons was discussing a plan to destroy Syria's estimated 1,000 metric ton arsenal, which includes mustard gas and the deadly nerve agent sarin. Syria says it wants the weapons destroyed outside the country, and the OPCW has described that as the most viable option. Caroline Kennedy, daughter of slain US President John F. Kennedy, arrived in Japan to take up the job of an ambassador a week before the 50th anniversary of her father's assassination. The appointment of Kennedy, a lawyer who was a strong supporter of US President Barack Obama during his first election campaign, brings the luster of a noted US political dynasty to Washington's relationship with a key Pacific ally. Thousands of Shiite Muslims took part on Thursday in the final day of celebrations for Ashura, a 10-day-long event commemorating the death of the Prophet Muhammad's grandson Imam Hussein in battle 1300 years ago. Shiites dressed in black marched in the streets of capital Manama and expressed their mourning by crying, whipping themselves and listening to poems and sermons about how Hussein and his family were martyred. Indonesia's Mount Sinabang erupted again on November 14, spewing volcanic ash that reached a height of 7 kilometers. About 5,500 people are now staying in evacuation centers. Many residents stay at the sites at night, but return home in the day to tend to cores. The volcano had been inactive for 4 centuries before first erupting in August 2010.
Shifting gears, time to bring you up to speed with all the sports news that you might have missed this week. Here's all the sports action.
Amid ear-splitting chanting of his name and a guard of honour by the West Indian cricketers, Sachin Tendulkar on Thursday walked into bat in his 200th and final test, leading to a phenomenal outpouring of emotions by the fans. Thousands of adoring fans filled into the stadium, many with their faces painted in the colours of the Indian flag and with either Sachin or 200 written on their foreheads to commemorate his 200th and last Test match. The 40-year-old Indian holds dozens of batting records which include making most runs and centuries in both Test and One-Day Internationals. He was the first batsman to score a double century in One-Day Internationals and is the only player to score 100 international centuries. Mexican Formula One driver Sergio Perez issued a statement confirming he would be leaving McLaren after just 1 year with the former champions, who are enduring their worst season since 1980. Neither the 23-year-old nor his teammate Britain's 2009 world champion Jenson Button have finished higher than 5th in 17 races so far. In a dignified letter posted on his Twitter feed, Perez left no doubt he had been forced out and would be looking elsewhere after the final 2 races in Texas and Brazil. Adventurer Sean Conway became the first person to swim the length of the British mainland from Land's End to John O'Groats. The 32-year-old left Land's End at the far western tip of England on June 30th and finished his epic swim, a distance of 1,407 kilometres by land, in John O'Groats in Scotland. Conway raised thousands of pounds for the War Child charity on the swim, which he said he undertook because people said it could not be done. Sweden's Henrik Stenson is bullish about his chances to win the race to Dubai, the European Order of Merit, at this week's European Tour Championship in Dubai. Stenson leads the way going into this week's season-ending $8 million event and has an advantage over Briton Justin Rose at the top of the money list. Although Stenson is the leader, a win by the second or fourth man would displace him from the top of the money pile.
That's all we have for you in this edition of World Panorama. See you next week, same time, with more international news. Till then, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. This week, I close the show with these dazzling visuals from Japan. Well, you must have heard of synchronized swimming. Now in Japan, there's synchronized precision walking. A group of Japanese students at Nippon Sports Science University have taken walking to a whole new level. This is me, Sana Khan, signing off.